The year was 1867. The Missouri Ozarks were drowning in silence, the kind of silence that swallowed every sound and turned even the whisper of wind into something sinister. The forests were thick, endless walls of twisted branches that hid more than they revealed. Nights were darker than pitch, the roads narrow and unpaved, and travelers often vanished without explanation. People blamed the wilderness, wild animals, or outlaws, but no one spoke openly about the brothers. Not yet. On the edge of a lonely dirt road stood an old wooden inn, its windows dark, its walls weathered by storms and secrets. The inn had no name, only a small sign swinging gently in the wind, creaking like an old coffin. To travelers, it was a blessing in the middle of nowhere, a place to rest, eat, and drink. But to those who lived nearby, it was something else entirely. A place where people entered but didn't always leave. Inside the inn, two brothers ran the place. Outsiders called them friendly, welcoming even, but those who watched closely saw something unnatural in their smiles. Their voices were soft, calm, too calm, as though they were always rehearsing every word before speaking. The older one poured the drinks, his hands steady as stone, while the younger one served them, flashing a polite smile that never reached his eyes. They always offered free water, claiming it was pure and fresh from the hills, and weary travelers gladly accepted. But in the Ozarks, purity was an illusion. One rainy night, a family of 4 arrived. 2 parents, a teenage son, and a young daughter. Their wagon wheels were coated in mud, their lantern burned low, and their faces carried exhaustion. The brothers welcomed them inside, offering warm food and shelter. The family sat near the fireplace, grateful, unaware of the danger breathing beside them. One of the brothers filled 4 glasses with water, setting them on the table with a strange gentleness, almost ritualistic. The little girl reached for hers first. Somewhere outside, thunder cracked violently, and the sound seemed to shake the entire inn. No one noticed the way the older brother's gaze lingered too long, his smile sharp in the glow of the firelight. No one noticed how the younger brother closed the curtains tighter, locking out the moonlight as though hiding something from the night itself. Within minutes, the room fell silent. The parents exchanged nervous glances as the little girl complained of dizziness, her small voice breaking into a confused whisper. The boy tried to stand, but stumbled, his hand knocking over the glass, spilling the untouched water across the wooden floor. The older brother's expression shifted for a moment. Annoyance, then something darker. But just as quickly, the smile returned. The parents struggled to move, their limbs growing heavy, their eyelids fluttering as though the weight of sleep was dragging them under. The boy, still conscious, crawled toward the door, but the younger brother knelt beside him, whispering something no one else could hear. Moments later, the boy's body went limp in his arms. By morning, the family was gone. The brothers told passing travelers that the family had left before sunrise, heading west. No one questioned them, no one dared. But a week later, a farmer found a torn piece of the young girl's dress snagged on a thorn bush deep in the woods, far from the road. That discovery never reached the sheriff. It disappeared, just like everything else connected to that inn. Locals began whispering stories in secret about poisoned water, strange chants echoing in the night, and travelers who vanished without a trace. But the brothers were clever. They charmed strangers, paid off questions with laughter, and buried suspicion under layers of hospitality. Still, there was something about them, something you couldn't quite name. Their eyes were too calm, their voices too measured, and the silence inside the inn felt heavy, as though the walls themselves had heard too many dying breaths to ever forget them. Outside, the Missouri winds carried the smell of rain and something else. Something metallic, faint but unmistakable. The smell of blood. And though no one yet knew it, the land around the inn was slowly becoming a graveyard. The rains didn't stop for 3 days. The Missouri Ozarks were drowning under endless storms, and the muddy roads turned into traps that swallowed wagon wheels whole. Travelers were forced to seek shelter wherever they could find it, and for many, the Brothers' Inn became their only hope. From the outside, the place looked harmless. Lamplight glowing softly through old windows, smoke rising gently from the crooked chimney. But behind those walls, hope was an illusion. On the 4th night of heavy rain, 3 men arrived, drenched and shivering, their boots caked in mud and faces pale from exhaustion. They were traders heading south, carrying goods wrapped tightly under oilskin, hoping to make it through the wilderness before winter set in. The brothers welcomed them warmly, as they always did, speaking softly, smiling easily, offering shelter from the storm. The older brother stoked the fire while the younger poured 3 glasses of water, setting them neatly on the table. "You must be tired," the younger one said, his voice low, almost soothing. "Drink, it will warm you." The traders didn't hesitate. The water was clear, cool, refreshing, and it carried no taste, no scent, nothing to warn them of the poison drifting silently within it. They drank as the brothers watched, their faces calm, their eyes unblinking. Minutes passed. One of the traders laughed nervously, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold air in the room. The second rubbed his chest, complaining of tightness, and the third reached for his throat. Confused, his voice trembling as he muttered something about dizziness, the older brother pretended to notice nothing, continuing to stir the pot of stew over the fire, humming softly, as though nothing unusual was happening. By the time the traders realized something was wrong, it was too late. Their hands trembled violently, their vision blurred, and their legs refused to obey them. The youngest among them collapsed first, his body shaking before falling silent on the floor. The second tried to crawl toward the door, but barely made it a few feet before his strength gave out. The third fought longest, his gasps echoing through the small inn until the younger brother knelt beside him and whispered softly into his ear. Whatever he said was quiet enough that no one else would hear, but the trader's wide, terrified eyes seemed to freeze in place at the sound of it. Moments later, his breathing stopped. The brothers worked quickly, moving with an efficiency that came from practice. The older one dragged the bodies toward the back room, while the younger snuffed out the lanterns, leaving the inn bathed in shadows. Outside, the storm drowned out everything, the scraping of boots, the creak of floorboards, even the soft thud of lifeless bodies being lowered onto wooden planks. By morning, the inn was spotless. The traders' belongings were gone, their wagon, wheels erased by the rain, their names already forgotten. To anyone passing by, nothing unusual had happened, but not everyone was blind. A farmhand named Eli, who lived less than a mile away, claimed he'd seen 3 figures arrive that night and none leave. He mentioned it to his employer, who told him to keep quiet, to mind his own business. Best not to stir trouble where it sleeps, the old man warned, and so Eli kept his silence. For a while. Rumors started to spread, slowly at first, then like wildfire. Locals whispered about missing travelers, about strange chanting carried by the wind late at night, about fires that burned behind the inn long after everyone had gone to sleep. Some claimed they saw figures moving through the woods, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth, heading toward the river where the soil was soft and easy to dig. One story told of a young woman who stopped at the inn while traveling alone to meet her fiancé. She was last seen at dinner, laughing softly, sipping from a glass of water the brothers had offered her. By sunrise, she was gone, her horse still tied to the post outside, its reins soaked in rain. When the sheriff questioned the brothers, they said she'd left before dawn, claiming she didn't want to lose time on the road. The sheriff believed them, or maybe he wanted to, because everyone feared them, Raza. Not openly, not enough to speak against them, but deep inside, they knew something was wrong. There was something in their calmness, in the way their voices never wavered, that set people on edge. And yet, without evidence, without bodies, there was nothing anyone could do. As the weeks passed, more travelers disappeared. Families, lone riders, merchants, vanishing like smoke into the Ozark mist. Some said the woods were cursed, others blamed wolves and outlaws. But no one wanted to admit the truth, because the truth was far worse than any wild animal. The inn continued to glow warmly at night, a beacon for the desperate and the lost. And every evening the brothers waited by the fire, their smiles patient, their hands steady, their voices soft and welcoming, always offering water, always watching. The Missouri Ozarks were breathing differently now. The forests no longer felt silent but watchful, as if the trees themselves had learned to keep secrets. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig underfoot carried weight, making travelers quicken their pace along the muddy roads. By the winter of 1867, the missing had grown in number, and though no one dared to say it aloud, everyone knew the same unspoken truth. The brothers' inn was cursed. Eli, the young farmhand who had seen the three traders arrive and never leave, couldn't sleep. The memory gnawed at him each night, replaying in fragments, the wagon's creaking wheels, the lamplight glowing through the inn's windows, the way the storm swallowed their tracks by morning. He tried convincing himself that maybe the men had left quietly, maybe he'd imagined it all, but something inside him wouldn't rest. One evening, just after dusk, Eli crept along the edge of the woods toward the inn. The fog clung low to the day, ground rolling like smoke, and the air smelled faintly metallic, a sharp tang that made his stomach tighten. He crouched behind a fallen log, close enough to see the glow from the windows, and waited. Inside, the brothers moved with their usual, unsettling calm. The older one was setting the table, carefully placing 3 glasses of water on polished wood, while the younger lit candles, the flames trembling as though they too were afraid. A knock came at the door. A single traveler entered. A man, in his 40s, dressed in a worn coat, his boots soaked with mud. The brothers greeted him warmly, offering him a seat by the fire. Eli leaned forward, straining to see more. Through the thin curtain, he watched the younger brother pour a glass of water and place it gently in front of the man. The traveler raised the glass without hesitation, drank deeply, and sighed with relief. Minutes later, his head began to tilt forward, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. Eli's stomach twisted as the man tried to stand, but stumbled, gripping the edge of the table for support. The older brother stepped behind him, steadying him with an almost affectionate hand on his shoulder. The younger one blew out a candle, plunging part of the room into shadow. And then Eli saw it, the traveler's body collapsing, limp and silent, as the brothers exchanged a glance that was neither shocked nor hurried, but practiced, deliberate. Eli stumbled backward, his breath ragged, heart pounding against his ribs. A twig snapped under his boot, and in the sudden silence, the sound was deafening. Inside the inn, the younger brother's head turned sharply toward the window. For a moment, Eli thought their eyes met through the glass, though the darkness hid his face. He ducked low, crawling along the damp earth, his hands trembling as he fought to stay silent. He didn't stop until the glow of the inn faded behind him, swallowed by the mist. That night, Eli swore never to return, but his fear turned into whispers, and whispers turned into rumors. Soon, more locals began sharing stories they had kept, locked away. A woodsman claimed he'd seen shallow pits, freshly dug near the riverbank, their edges damp and caving in, as though something or someone had been buried hastily. A washerwoman who lived nearby said she woke one night to hear muffled screams carried by the wind, followed by silence so heavy it made her ears ring. But when a traveling preacher went missing, everything changed. He had stopped at the inn one rainy afternoon, his horse tied neatly to the post outside, his Bible tucked under his arm. By morning, the horse remained, but the preacher was gone. The sheriff questioned the brothers, who smiled softly and said he'd left before dawn. The sheriff searched their property, his lantern casting long shadows across the floorboards, but found nothing unusual. No blood, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Still, the unease deepened. Families traveling west began avoiding the road altogether, choosing longer, harder paths just to keep their distance, but some weren't so lucky. Strangers unfamiliar with the rumors continued to vanish, their names whispered for a few days before fading like smoke in the cold Ozark air. Eli couldn't escape the memory of what he'd seen, the traveler drinking, the water, his body collapsing, the brothers working in perfect silence as if following a script. He tried warning a few people, but most didn't believe him. "It's just the storms," they'd say. "The wilderness takes what it wants." Others, though, grew pale when he spoke, their silence louder than denial. One night, the fear finally drove Eli to follow a hunch. Carrying only a lantern, he walked toward the river, where the woodsman claimed to have seen the pits. The air was thick with damp earth and decay, the sound of rushing water muffled under the weight of fog. And then he found them. Shallow graves. The soil was loose, disturbed, marked by the faint impression of hands dragging something heavy. Eli's lantern flickered as his breath quickened. He knelt to touch the earth, cold and wet, when his fingers brushed against something smooth beneath the dirt. He froze, heart pounding, before scraping away a layer of mud. And there it was. Bone. Small, delicate. A fragment of a human jaw. Eli staggered backward, his lantern clattering to the ground, the flame hissing out on impact. Darkness swallowed him whole. Behind him, somewhere in the distance, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, steady. He didn't wait to see who or what was coming. He ran, branches tearing at his clothes, his lungs burning with every gasp, until he reached the safety of his home. That night he didn't sleep, and by morning he realized something chilling. He could never speak of what he'd found, because if the brothers learned he'd been there, if they knew he had seen too much, he wouldn't live to tell the tale. Outside, the inn stood silent, its windows dark, its walls hiding secrets. The earth was slowly swallowing, and inside, the brothers waited, patient as always, for the next weary traveler to knock on their door, always offering water, always watching. By the winter of 1867, the Missouri Ozarks had changed. The land felt different, as though it had begun to breathe with the weight of secrets buried beneath it. Travelers moved faster along the muddy roads, heads down, voices low, refusing to linger after dusk. It wasn't the storms anymore that frightened them, nor the wild animals, nor the endless dark of the woods. It was the silence surrounding the brothers' inn, a silence so heavy it clung to the air like damp fog, choking every sound until even whispers felt dangerous. Word was spreading quietly, carried not in newspapers or letters, but in murmurs behind locked doors. No one dared speak too loudly, afraid the walls had ears. Families huddled around fireplaces, whispering stories of the missing, wondering how many bodies lay hidden beneath the sodden earth. Some claimed the brothers poisoned travelers for money, others believed something darker, rituals, sacrifices, offerings to something older than man itself. Late at night, strange stories surfaced, whispered by those too frightened to believe them. A hunter swore he saw fires burning behind the inn long after midnight, their orange glow flickering against the trees while shapes moved in silence around the flames. A washerwoman claimed she heard chanting carried on the wind, low and rhythmic, Like a prayer spoken to no god, she knew. A trapper returning from the river said he saw the younger brother digging near the bank, his lantern casting long skeletal shadows across the ground. When the trapper called out to him, the younger brother turned, smiled faintly, and said nothing. Soon, no one traveled that road unless they had no choice. Yet despite the warnings, despite the fear, people kept disappearing. The Ozarks swallowed them whole, leaving behind wagons abandoned in mud, horses wandering aimlessly, and belongings scattered like broken pieces of forgotten lives. The brothers, as always, smiled softly when questioned, their voices calm, steady, polite. They offered condolences to grieving families. They prayed with neighbors in church on Sundays. They fooled everyone, almost. But Eli couldn't stay silent anymore. The young farmhand barely slept, haunted by what he'd seen through the inn's window and by what he'd found buried near the river. The memory of the traveler's limp body collapsing after drinking the water returned to him every night, just as vivid as the bone he'd unearthed from the damp earth. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the brothers standing silently in the shadows, watching him. He decided to confide in someone he trusted, Old Man Harris, a trapper who had lived in the Ozarks his entire life. Harris listened without interruption, his weathered face unreadable as Eli spoke in a trembling voice, describing the poisoned water, the silent deaths, the shallow graves. When Eli finished, Harris leaned forward, his voice low and rough. "You need to leave it alone," he warned. "Those boys aren't just killers. There's something wrong with them, something not right, not natural." Eli frowned, his chest tight. "What do you mean?" Harris stared into the fire, his voice barely above a whisper. "I seen things, long before you were born. Back when their father owned that land, there were stories. Strange disappearances, fires in the woods, animals turning up dead without a mark on them. Folks said he was into dark things, old things. And when he died, the boys took over." Eli swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Are you saying this has been going on for years?" Harris nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the fire. "Decades." Outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers scratching to get in. Eli sat in silence, his thoughts tangled in fear and disbelief. If Harris was right, this wasn't just murder. This was something deeper, older, and far more dangerous than he had imagined. Meanwhile, the Ozarks seemed to darken with each passing night. Travelers reported hearing strange noises deep in the woods, low hums, almost like voices carried through the fog. Some claimed to see shapes moving between the trees, silent and watching, too far to identify yet too close to ignore. Horses panicked for no reason, dogs barked at empty doorways, and in the distance sometimes there was smoke rising from the inn long after everyone should have been asleep. One night, a preacher traveling from Springfield stopped in a nearby village and warned the townsfolk of evil creeping through the hills. He said the land was cursed, soaked in blood and sin, and that the devil himself walked among them disguised as men. His sermon stirred fear, and for weeks afterward, families locked their doors tight, refusing to step outside after sunset. But fear alone couldn't stop the missing from multiplying. The sheriff tried to keep order, but without proof, there was little he could do. He questioned the brothers again and again, walking the inn's halls with his lantern, checking the rooms, peering into the kitchen where the fire burned steadily. He found nothing. No blood, no signs of violence, no evidence at all. The brothers always cooperated, smiling faintly, answering every question softly, their calmness infuriating in its perfection. But the sheriff couldn't ignore the numbers. By the end of the year, more than a dozen travelers had vanished without a trace. Behind closed doors, he began keeping a secret ledger, recording names, dates, and the last known places they'd been seen. The brothers' inn came up again and again, like a shadow that couldn't be erased. Eli, desperate for answers, returned to the riverbank one night, lantern in hand, determined to dig deeper. He followed the soft earth where he had found the first bone, tracing faint drag marks left in the mud. The silence of the forest pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of running water. He knelt by the river's edge, digging with shaking hands until his lantern's glow revealed something pale beneath the soil. This time, it wasn't just a fragment. It was a full skull, its hollow sockets staring blindly into the night. Eli dropped it instantly, falling backward into the damp grass, his breath ragged and uneven. His lantern flickered wildly, throwing jagged shadows across the trees, and for a moment he thought he saw movement in the darkness beyond. A figure, standing, still, watching him. He froze, unable to move, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then slowly, the figure stepped forward, just enough for the lantern light to catch its face, the younger brother. Eli scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward, his boots slipping in the mud. The younger brother didn't speak, didn't chase him. He only stood there, head slightly tilted, a faint smile curving his lips, as though he knew exactly what Eli had found. And exactly what it meant. Eli didn't stop running until the lights of the nearest farmhouse came into view, but even there, even inside, surrounded by walls and locks, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Back at the inn, the windows glowed softly in the night, their light cutting faint paths through the fog. Inside, the brothers sat at their table, silent as statues, glasses of water untouched before them. Between them lay an old, leather-bound book, its pages covered in strange symbols and faded ink, a language no one in the Ozarks could read, and, outside, beneath the wet earth, the ground kept its secrets. For now. The winter air was sharp, carrying the weight of silence through the Missouri Ozarks, a silence that felt almost alive, heavy with things unsaid. By early 1868, the missing were no longer isolated cases. They had become a pattern, one the locals feared but dared not name. Whispers swirled through nearby villages, always soft, always behind closed doors, because everyone knew that speaking too loudly about the brothers was dangerous. People had started avoiding the inn altogether, choosing longer, harsher paths, through the woods. But for those who didn't know, for those passing through unaware, the road remained a trap, waiting to be sprung. One of them was Samuel Pike, a 24-year-old blacksmith from Arkansas. He was traveling north to find work, his horse carrying little more than a small satchel of tools and a Bible tucked into his coat pocket. By dusk, the temperature dropped sharply, and snowflakes drifted lazily from the gray sky, settling on his shoulders. The road ahead was fading into darkness, and Samuel knew he needed shelter. That's when he saw the inn's lamplight glowing faintly through the fog, a beacon in the endless stretch of wilderness. He tied his horse outside and stepped in, the smell of wood smoke wrapping around him instantly, warm and inviting. Inside, the older brother greeted him with soft words, his voice low and smooth as though rehearsed. The younger brother appeared moments later, carrying a glass of water, smiling faintly as he set it on the table. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before drinking deeply, the cold liquid soothing his dry throat. At first, nothing felt wrong. The brothers asked casual questions, where he was traveling from, where he was headed, whether he preferred rabbit stew or venison. Their calmness was unsettling, their smiles polite but hollow, and yet Samuel told himself he was imagining it. He was tired, hungry, he needed to rest. But minutes later, his vision blurred. His heart raced wildly as a strange heat climbed his neck, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. The room tilted sideways and his breath came in ragged gasps as panic clawed at his chest. The older brother spoke softly to the younger, their voices too low to hear, and Samuel's body began to fail him entirely. "I remember. My arms wouldn't move," Samuel would later say, his voice shaking. like my muscles weren't mine anymore. I could hear everything, see everything, but I couldn't speak. He watched helplessly as the brothers leaned close, their shadows bending over him, their faces calm, almost tender, as though this was something they'd done 100 times before. The younger brother tilted Samuel's chin up, whispering, something so soft and rhythmic that Samuel couldn't understand the words but felt their weight like a stone pressing against his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Then, by chance or fate, the sound of a rider's approaching horse broke the silence outside. Hoofbeats struck the frozen earth, fast and heavy, followed by a man's voice calling out through the storm. The brothers exchanged a glance, sharp and silent. Without a word, the younger one stood and walked quickly to the window, peering through the fog, while the older brother straightened Samuel's limp body in his chair, forcing his head upright, as if nothing was wrong. The door burst open and a local farmer stepped inside, shaking off the snow from his coat. "Evening," he muttered, his eyes darting between Samuel and the brothers. Samuel wanted to scream, to beg for help, but his body wouldn't listen. He sat there, rigid and silent, staring at the farmer with wide, panicked eyes. Something in that look must have unsettled the farmer, because his expression tightened. "You all right there, son?" he asked cautiously. The older brother answered smoothly before Samuel could even try to respond. "Tired traveler," he said softly. "Long road behind him." The farmer lingered, suspicious, but eventually nodded. "Best you let him rest," he said, before grabbing his package from the counter and heading back into the cold. As the door closed, the younger brother exhaled sharply, frustration flashing briefly in his eyes. The moment was ruined, and Samuel was still breathing. The brothers moved quickly, whispering to each other, their calmness replaced by quiet urgency. Samuel's head lolled forward as they argued in hushed tones. And then, suddenly, something changed. The dizziness began to lift. Slowly, like waking from a nightmare, Samuel felt control returning to his limbs. The pounding in his chest softened, and though his vision was still blurred, he could move again. Without hesitation, he slid from his chair, crashing to the wooden floor. The younger brother turned sharply, startled by the noise, but Samuel was already crawling, his hands clawing against the rough planks, dragging himself toward the door. "Stop," the older brother said quietly, his voice low but commanding. Samuel's heart thundered at the sound, but he didn't stop. He forced his legs to move, stumbling upright as his body screamed against him. The younger one lunged forward, his hand brushing Samuel's shoulder, but Samuel twisted free and shoved the door open, bursting into the freezing night air. Snow stung his face as he staggered to his horse, fumbling with the reins, his breath ragged and uneven. Behind him, the brothers stood in the doorway, watching, their faces expressionless in the faint light spilling from inside the inn. He mounted clumsily, his boots slipping in the snow, and spurred the horse hard, riding blindly into the darkness. He didn't look back until he was miles away, the inn's glow nothing more than a fading ember behind him. Samuel Pike became the only known survivor. Weeks later, he stumbled into a nearby village, pale and trembling, his voice hoarse from silence. It took him days before he could speak clearly, and when he finally told his story, the townsfolk listened in stunned silence. He spoke of the poisoned water, of his paralysis, of the soft chanting he didn't understand but felt deep in his bones. Some believed him instantly, others accused him of fever dreams, but Eli, listening from the back of the room, knew Samuel was telling the truth. There was Eli, pale and restless, his hands twisting his hat nervously. Beside him sat Reverend Caleb Hensley, a stern man of God whose faith had been shaken by the growing number of missing travelers. Then there was Matthew Cole, a former Union soldier hardened by war, and Jonah Briggs, a trapper who knew the Ozark wilderness better than anyone alive. Granger laid the locket on the table. "This belonged to Clara Hastings," he said quietly. "I found it buried by the riverbank where..." The brothers go at night. The room fell silent. Reverend Caleb's lips moved in silent prayer, while Jonah swore under his breath. Matthew leaned forward, his scarred knuckles tapping against the wood. "You saying they're killing folks, Sheriff?" Matthew asked, his voice low. Granger nodded slowly. "I'm saying there's a field of graves out there, and if we don't act, there'll be more." Eli shifted uneasily, glancing toward the darkened window. "What if they know we're coming? What if they're watching us right now?" "They already know," Granger replied. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he poured a measure of whiskey. "Last night, I found one of the graves. They caught me digging, stood there watching me. Didn't say a word. Then they walked away." Reverend Caleb shivered and crossed himself. "Lord have mercy. If men can watch death uncovered and feel nothing, their souls are gone." Jonah leaned forward, his voice low and rough. "Then, let's put him in the ground with the rest." Granger shook his head sharply. "No, not yet. We need proof first. The town won't believe us without it. Tomorrow night we dig, quietly, south bank of the river. We find what's buried there, and then we decide." The men nodded, each silently accepting the weight of what lay ahead. The following night, the five of them crept into the woods beneath a moonless sky. The air was damp, heavy with fog, and the trees whispered faintly in the cold wind. Lanterns were kept low, their light barely touching the ground as they followed the sheriff to the clearing by the riverbank. The earth here looked untouched, smooth and soft, but Granger's instincts told him the truth lay beneath. They began digging in silence, the muffled thud of shovels the only sound in the still night. Minutes passed, then an hour. The cold bit deep into their bones, but they didn't stop. Finally, Jonah's spade struck something solid. "Sheriff," he whispered sharply. "Over here." Granger knelt beside him, brushing away the damp soil until pale fabric emerged, tightly wrapped and bound with coarse twine. Matthew helped lift the bundle carefully, placing it on the frozen ground. Granger hesitated only a moment before cutting the bindings with his hunting knife. The cloth peeled back slowly, revealing the skeletal remains of a man, jaw locked, fingers curled tightly, as though death had come hard and fast. The bones were marked with strange, deep grooves, too precise to be the work of animals. Reverend Caleb dropped to his knees, murmuring prayers beneath his breath. Eli turned away, retching quietly against a tree. They dug deeper. One grave became 2. 2 became 5. And then Jonah stumbled upon something that made his hands freeze around the handle of his shovel. "Sheriff, you need to see this." They gathered around as he lifted a small blackened object from the soil. At first, it looked like a piece of charred wood, but as Granger brushed away the dirt, his chest tightened. It wasn't wood, it was bone, human bone, burned and polished smooth. Dozens of similar fragments surfaced as they dug further, some carved, with strange, intricate markings, spirals and symbols that none of them recognized. Reverend Caleb crossed himself again, his face pale. "These ain't just murders," Jonah muttered, his voice trembling now despite his rough exterior. "This is something else, something older." Granger clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm, but inside, dread clawed at his ribs. Poison, bodies, chanting, burned bones marked with symbols. It wasn't random. The brothers were following a ritual. Then came the worst discovery of all. Beneath the final grave, deeper than the rest, they uncovered a crude wooden box. The wood was dark, damp and soft from years underground. But when Matthew pried it open, the air filled with a foul stench that made them all recoil. Inside were dozens of glass vials, sealed with wax, each containing a dark, tar-like liquid. Eli's voice cracked as he whispered, "What is that?" Granger didn't answer. He didn't have to. He knew. Poison. The same poison Samuel Pike had tasted. The same poison they'd been giving travelers for years. But why keep so much of it stored underground? Why hide it in a box buried deeper than the bodies? As they stood there, the river whispered faintly behind them, carrying the sound of running water through the trees. Then, suddenly, another sound joined it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching softly through the frozen earth. The 5 men turned as one, lantern light swinging wildly, throwing jagged shadows across the clearing. And there, just beyond the tree line, stood the brothers, silent, still, watching. The younger one stepped forward, his pale face catching the faint glow of the lanterns. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried easily through the cold air. "Digging graves in the dark, Sheriff," he said softly, almost kindly. "Careful. You might find something you ain't ready to see." The older brother stood. Behind him, his eyes fixed on the box of poison, his jaw set tight. Neither man raised a weapon, neither shouted. They simply stood there, letting the weight of their presence choke the air. Granger's hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw it. The others waited, tense and silent, hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, the younger brother smiled faintly, just a ghost of a smile, and stepped back into the shadows. The older one followed, their figures dissolving into the fog without another word. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before. Granger turned to his men, his voice low and firm. "We take what we found and leave, now." They gathered the vials, the locket, and one carved bone fragment, covering the graves as best they could before retreating through the woods. That night, none of them slept, because now they knew the truth. The brothers weren't just killers, they were keeping records, and whatever ritual they were performing with those bodies, it wasn't finished yet. The sun never fully rose that morning. A heavy gray fog settled over the Missouri Ozarks, swallowing the trees, the hills, and the river in a thick, damp silence. Sheriff Thomas Granger hadn't slept. His hands were raw from digging, his mind aching from everything they'd uncovered. The graves, the burned bones, the carved symbols, the vials of poison. But what haunted him most wasn't the discoveries themselves. It was the brothers. The way they had appeared silently in the clearing. The way they had stood watching, calm and unafraid, like men who didn't fear death because they'd already mastered it. Granger knew this was bigger than him now. Bigger than Eli, bigger than the search party, bigger than their quiet little town. He needed authority, power, someone who could act before more travelers disappeared. That afternoon, he rode hard for Ashford, the county seat 2 towns over, where Judge Edwin Harper presided. Harper was known to be an honest man, or so Granger thought. He brought everything he had: the brass locket, one of the carved bone fragments, a sealed vial of poison, and Samuel Pike's written statement. The judge's office was warm and quiet, filled with the smell of pipe smoke and old wood. Harper sat behind his desk, spectacles perched on his nose, his silver hair neat and combed. Granger placed the items one by one on the polished surface. "I need a warrant," Granger said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "For the inn, for the brothers. Judge, they're killing people." Harper adjusted his spectacles, leaning forward to examine the evidence. He turned the locket in his hands, studied the markings on the carved bone, and held the vial to the light, his expression grave. "This is disturbing," Harper admitted softly. "But Sheriff, without bodies, without something indisputable, the law ties my hands. You dig up half the riverbank and all you've got is one locket and some bones without names." "I've got more than that," Granger snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. "I've got poison, I've got witness testimony, I've got—" Harper raised a hand, silencing him. The men you're accusing, they're well connected. Their father was a land surveyor. Their uncle fought alongside half this county in the war. If you accuse them publicly without ironclad proof, you'll lose your badge and they'll walk free. Granger stared at him in disbelief. So we wait until there's another body, another family that never sees their loved one again. The judge sighed deeply, removing his spectacles and rubbing his temples. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost hesitant. Sheriff, let it go. Granger blinked, frozen for a moment. What did you just say? Harper leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. There are forces here you don't understand. People in this county, people in this state, have interests tied to those brothers. You push too hard, you won't just lose your badge, you'll lose your life. For a long moment, Granger just stared at him, his throat dry, his hands clenched into fists. Then he gathered the evidence from the desk without another word and walked out. By nightfall, the town felt different. Eyes followed him wherever he went. Conversation stopped when he passed. It was as if someone had whispered his name to the wrong people. Samuel described the brothers in chilling detail, their calmness, their practiced movements, the way they seemed to know exactly when death would come. He said their eyes were wrong somehow, too steady, too cold, like the gaze of men who had seen too much and felt too little. And though he escaped, he carried something back with him, a lingering sense that he had been marked, as though leaving had not freed him from whatever darkness lived inside that inn. The sheriff took Samuel's statement, but still couldn't act without evidence. No bodies, no proof, no crime he could prove on paper. But privately, he began to suspect the missing ledger wasn't long enough to contain all the names that should have been written there. Meanwhile, Samuel left the Ozarks and never returned. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, didn't write letters, didn't leave a trace. Some said he went west. Others claimed he disappeared entirely, swallowed by the wilderness just like the others. Eli, however, believed something else entirely, that Samuel hadn't escaped at all. Not really. He might have left the inn behind, but he carried a piece of it inside him. And far away, hidden behind the heavy curtains of the inn, the brothers waited patiently, their glasses of water lined neatly on the table, untouched and glimmering in the soft candlelight, always offering water, always watching. The first frost of 1868 came early, coating the Missouri Ozarks in a thin layer of ice that shimmered under the pale moonlight. Winter silence hung heavy across the valley, broken only by the occasional creak of trees bending against the cold wind. Yet inside the sheriff's office, silence had no place. Sheriff Thomas Granger sat alone at his desk, the lamplight throwing restless shadows across his weathered face as he turned Samuel Pike's statement over and over in his hands. The words wouldn't leave him. Water first. Couldn't move. Chanting, eyes too calm. He'd read them a dozen times, but each repetition only deepened the pit in his stomach. Granger had been sheriff for 16 years, seen more than his share of outlaws, highwaymen, and killers. But something about this case unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the missing travelers or the rumors of poison. It was the quiet confidence of the brothers, the way they'd smiled when questioned, as though daring him to dig deeper. That night, he summoned Eli, the young farmhand who'd been whispering for months about what he'd seen near the inn. The boy arrived after dark, shivering beneath a thin coat, his hat clutched in both hands. He hesitated at the door, casting nervous glances over his shoulder before stepping inside. "You're safe here," Granger said softly, closing the shutters and bolting the door. "Now tell me everything." Eli swallowed hard. "Sheriff, they ain't right. I've seen 'em out there, night after night, always after the moon's high. They go down by the river with something heavy wrapped in cloth. Every time they come back without it." Granger's jaw tightened. "You ever see where they go exactly?" Eli hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. South bank, where the ground's soft. The sheriff leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight, the pieces falling into place. Bodies buried near the river. If Samuel Pike had lived to tell his story, maybe dozens hadn't. But Granger couldn't move openly. If he confronted the brothers without evidence, the town would turn against him. Some still believed the missing travelers had simply lost their way, eaten by wolves or swept down river. Others feared the brothers so deeply they wouldn't speak their names after sunset. So he waited, planned, and watched. For 2 weeks, Granger observed the inn from a distance, keeping to the tree line at night with Eli by his side. On the third night, they saw the first sign. The brothers stepped out into the cold, each carrying a wooden crate between them. The moonlight struck their faces, pale and expressionless, as they made their way into the woods. Neither spoke a word. They moved with eerie synchronization, like shadows performing a ritual they'd repeated 100 times before. Granger and Eli followed carefully, boots sinking into the frozen ground. The air was bitter, sharp in their lungs, and each breath came out in clouds. The brothers led them deeper, past twisted oaks and frost-bitten brush, until they reached the riverbank where the earth dipped low and soft. There they stopped. Granger and Eli crouched behind a fallen tree, watching. The brothers set the crate down and opened it slowly. Granger's hand tightened on his revolver, but when the lid creaked back, what lay inside was not a body, but bundles of fabric, clothing, boots, and personal belongings tied neatly with twine. The older brother lifted each bundle with meticulous care and placed it into a shallow pit, already dug into the soft earth. Then came something stranger. The younger brother knelt beside the pit, his lips moving rapidly, whispering words the sheriff couldn't hear but felt deep in his bones like an echo carried on the wind. When he finished, he covered the pit carefully, smoothing the earth flat with his palms until it looked untouched. No markers, no names, nothing left to find. Eli shivered violently, his breath ragged in the darkness. "Sheriff, what are they doing? Why hide things like that?" Granger didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't have the words. The brothers walked back toward the inn, their lanterns swinging in silence, leaving Granger and Eli frozen behind them. They waited until the shadows disappeared before stepping into the clearing. Granger knelt by the fresh soil, running his gloved hand across the surface, his breath heavy. That was when he noticed it, half buried in the mud where the crate had been, glinting faintly in the moonlight, a brass locket. He picked it up, wiping away the dirt, and flipped it open. Inside was a small portrait of a young woman with soft brown eyes and a delicate smile. On the back, etched faintly into the metal, were 2 words, "To Clara." Granger's stomach sank. He remembered Clara Hastings. She'd gone missing 6 months earlier while traveling to meet her fiancé. Her parents had begged him to search, but there'd been no sign of her wagon, no trace of her horse, no trail to follow, until now. He slipped the locket into his coat pocket and turned sharply to Eli. "Don't speak of this to anyone, not yet." Eli nodded, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. That night Granger couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the brothers' shadows by the riverbank. The younger one whispering into the cold air as if offering names to the earth. He thought of Clara, of the traders, of the lone riders who never reached their destinations. How many? How many graves lay hidden beneath the soft Missouri soil, nameless and silent? By morning, he'd made his decision. He would search the riverbank, alone. The following night, under a new moon, Granger returned without Eli. He brought only a lantern, a spade, and his revolver. The woods were deathly quiet, his breath loud, in his ears as he knelt where he'd seen the brothers before. He dug slowly, carefully, praying he'd find nothing. But 2 feet down, his spade struck something solid. He froze, his heart pounding. Then, with trembling hands, he brushed the soil away until pale fabric emerged. Cloth wrapped tightly around something long and stiff. Granger's lantern flickered, the flame struggling against the icy wind, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to close in around him. He unwrapped the cloth slowly, each fold revealing more until finally he saw it. A hand, the skin gray, the fingers stiff, the nails packed with dirt. He staggered back, choking on his breath, his mind reeling as the truth finally struck him. Samuel Pike had escaped, yes, but dozens, maybe hundreds, had not. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch snapped. Granger spun, his revolver raised, lantern swinging wildly, throwing light across the trees. Silence. Then faintly, a voice. "You shouldn't." "Be here, Sheriff." The words were soft, steady, and chillingly calm. The younger brother stood just beyond the lantern's reach, his pale face half hidden by shadow. The older one was beside him, silent, his gaze fixed and unblinking. Granger's finger tightened on the trigger, but neither brother moved. They simply stood there, watching him. And then, slowly, they turned and walked back toward the inn, their figures dissolving into the darkness like ghosts returning to their graves. Granger stood frozen, his breath shallow, his body trembling, not from the cold, but from the realization that they had caught him digging. And let him live, for now. The morning after his confrontation with the brothers, Sheriff Thomas Granger sat alone in his office, staring at the brass locket resting in his palm. The portrait of Clara Hastings stared back at him, her smile frozen. In time, her eyes holding secrets that would never be spoken again. The weight of the locket felt heavier than any badge he'd ever worn. He knew now, beyond doubt, that the brothers were killers, but knowing was one thing. Proving it was another. He couldn't confront them alone, not anymore. They had seen him at the riverbank. They had let him live, which terrified him more than if they had tried to kill him outright. It meant they were confident. Confident he couldn't touch them. Confident the soil itself would hide their crimes. Granger needed allies, men he could trust with their lives and their silence. That night, under the cover of darkness, he gathered 4 men in the back room of the Black, Hollow Tavern. The air smelled of smoke and damp wood, and the flickering lamplight cast sharp shadows across their faces. Meanwhile, Eli couldn't sleep either. Since the night at the riverbank, he'd been plagued by nightmares, visions of burned bones and pale faces, of strange whispers carried by the wind. But on this particular night, fear wasn't enough to keep him inside. He had to know what was happening inside the inn. So, long after midnight, Eli crept through the woods, keeping low to the ground, every snapped twig making his heart jolt. The inn glowed faintly in the distance, its windows lit with soft, flickering candlelight. No sound came from inside, not laughter, not voices, not footsteps. He reached the stable behind the inn and crouched low, peering through a narrow gap in the wall. At first he saw nothing unusual. The dining room looked warm and quiet, the table set neatly with polished silver and clean plates, as though awaiting travelers. But then his breath caught in his throat. The brothers entered from the back hall, carrying something between them, a long wooden box, dark with dampness. They set it gently on the table and opened it slowly, almost reverently. Inside lay a man. Eli's hand clamped over his mouth to stifle the scream rising in his throat. The man wasn't moving. His skin was pale, his chest still, his eyes half open as though frozen mid-blink. The younger brother leaned close, holding a small glass vial filled with black liquid. He tilted the man's head back and poured the contents into his mouth. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then Eli saw the man's chest rise, shallow, Trembling breaths rasped from his lips. His fingers twitched faintly against the wooden box, clawing weakly at the edges. The older brother placed a hand on the man's forehead, whispering something low and rhythmic, the same strange cadence Samuel Pike had described. The sound wasn't like prayer. It was older, darker, carrying weight Eli could feel in his bones. The man gasped suddenly, sitting upright with wide, glassy eyes. But there was nothing human left in them. Eli stumbled backward, nearly falling into the snow outside. The stable wall, his breath ragged and uneven. He forced himself to stay quiet, pressing his back against the wood, willing his body to disappear into the darkness. Inside, the brothers continued their ritual, their voices growing louder, almost melodic, filling the inn with an unnatural hum. The newly awakened man stood shakily, his movements jerky and stiff, as though controlled by invisible strings. And then, without warning, his head turned toward the stable window, toward Eli. Their eyes met. The man's gaze was hollow, empty, but fixed on him, unblinking. Eli's body went rigid with terror. He waited for someone to shout, for footsteps to thunder toward him, but none came. Instead, the man turned back to the brothers, silent and obedient, like a puppet awaiting commands. Eli ran. He didn't stop, until he reached the sheriff's house, pounding on the door until Granger appeared, revolver in hand, eyes bleary from exhaustion. "Eli?" Granger barked. "What the hell's wrong with you?" Eli was shaking violently, struggling to breathe. "Sheriff, I saw him. I saw what they did. That man. He was dead, I swear it. I saw his skin, saw his eyes. He wasn't breathing, but they brought him back." Granger grabbed his shoulders, steadying him. "Eli, slow down. Tell me exactly what you saw." Eli's voice broke as he whispered, "They ain't just killing, Sheriff. They're keeping him." Granger stared at him, his stomach sinking into a pit of cold dread. Suddenly, a noise outside made them both freeze, the soft crunch of footsteps on snow. Granger reached for his lantern and edged toward the window, peering into the darkness. The street was empty, silent. But when he opened the door, there on the porch sat a single glass of water, beading with condensation in the freezing air. No note, no words, just the glass. Granger stared at it, his breath slow and heavy, before reaching down and placing it gently on the table. "They know," he said quietly. "They're warning us." Behind him, Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sheriff, if they can make the dead walk, how do we stop them?" Granger didn't answer because he didn't know. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, covering the Missouri Ozarks in a pale, ghostly shroud. The silence outside the sheriff's office was suffocating, broken only by the low whistle of wind slipping through cracks in the old wooden walls. Inside, Sheriff Thomas Granger sat at his desk, revolver laid out in front of him, his hand resting near the grip. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. He couldn't. The glass of water they'd left on his porch still sat untouched on the table. Every time his eyes drifted to it, his chest tightened. It wasn't just a warning. It was a message. "We know where you sleep. We know where you hide." Eli sat across from him, his knees bouncing nervously, his face pale and hollow-eyed. "You're sure about what you saw?" Granger asked for the 3rd time. Eli's voice was shaky but steady enough. "Sheriff, I know what I saw. The man was dead. I swear it. And when they poured that black stuff down his throat, he came back, breathing, moving. But he wasn't right." Granger rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "If you're right, son, we ain't dealing with just killers anymore." He stood, sliding his revolver into its holster. "We ride at dawn." By sunrise, Granger had gathered a small posse. 4 men he trusted with his life. Deputy Harlan Briggs, the fastest shot in the county. Joseph Hale, a rugged trapper who knew the Ozark woods better than anyone. Levi Crow, a quiet but deadly tracker, and Eli, trembling but determined, carrying his father's rifle. The 5 men rode in silence, their breath steaming in the cold morning air, horses crunching through the snow as fog hung low over the trees. The inn appeared slowly from the mist, its dark silhouette rising from the clearing like some ancient beast crouched in wait. The shutters were closed. No smoke came from the chimney. The place looked abandoned, but Granger knew better. "Remember," he whispered, pulling his rifle from the saddle, "no one drinks a damn thing they offer." They dismounted quietly, fanning out around the inn. Granger led Eli and Levi to the front door, while Briggs and Hale circled to the rear. The sheriff raised his hand, counted silently to 3, then kicked the door open with a crash. The stench hit them immediately, something sweet, metallic and rotten, all at once. Inside, the inn was dimly lit by a few guttering candles. The dining tables were still set as if waiting for guests, plates polished and glasses lined perfectly, but the air was wrong. It was heavy. "Clear the rooms," Granger ordered. Levi moved down the hallway while Eli stuck close behind the sheriff, his hands trembling as he gripped the rifle. They checked the kitchen, the pantry, the small storeroom, but everything was empty. Too empty. Then Briggs' voice called from the back. "Sheriff, you need to see this." They regrouped in the rear hallway, where Briggs stood near a section of floorboards pried slightly open. Beneath them was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft rose from below, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of death. Granger lit a lantern, motioning for the men to follow. "Stay sharp." The wooden steps creaked under their boots as they descended into the shadows. The air grew colder, damp and oppressive, like stepping into the lungs of the earth itself. At the bottom, they entered a stone-walled cellar lit by oil lamps, their faint glow revealing something that made Eli's stomach turn. Dozens of wooden crates lined the walls, stacked floor to ceiling, each one marked with strange symbols carved into the lid. Some were sealed tight, others sat slightly open, revealing scraps of cloth, leather satchels and personal effects, belongings of missing travelers. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the center of the cellar stood 3 iron tables, each one stained dark with old blood. Beside them were shelves lined with glass vials filled with liquids of every color, amber, crimson, black. Some still bubbled faintly, releasing thin streams of vapor into the cold air. "God help us," Briggs whispered. "What the hell were they doing down here?" Before Granger could answer, a low moan drifted from the far corner of the cellar. Eli froze. Slowly, lantern held high, Granger moved toward the sound. Behind a row of crates, they found a narrow corridor blocked by an iron gate. Inside the gate, chained to the walls, were 6 people, or what was left of them. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes clouded with milky film. Some twitched weakly, their movements unnatural, jerky, as though their bodies no longer obeyed their minds. One man's lips moved soundlessly, as though whispering words that had long since left his memory. "Sweet Lord," Hale muttered, crossing himself. Eli turned away, gagging, but Granger grabbed the lantern and stepped closer, studying the symbols carved into the stone around the chamber. They weren't English. They weren't anything he recognized. "They ain't just poisoning folks," Granger said quietly. "They're experimenting." Suddenly a loud creak echoed from above, the sound of the front door slamming shut. The brothers were home. Granger doused the lantern, plunging the cellar into near darkness. He motioned for the men to spread out, rifles ready, hearts pounding in the suffocating silence. Footsteps descended the stairs, slowly, deliberately. One step, then another, then another. The younger brother appeared first, carrying a lantern, his face calm, expression unreadable. The older one followed behind, holding a long hunting knife, its blade reflecting the faint glow of the oil light. "You shouldn't have come here," the older brother said softly, his voice carrying eerily in the narrow chamber. "This place ain't for you." Granger stepped forward, rifle aimed square at his chest. "It ain't for nobody, and you know it. Hands where I can see 'em." The brothers exchanged a look, then smiled in unison. "You think you can stop this?" the younger one whispered, almost laughing. "Sheriff, this ain't about us. We're just keepers of the well." Granger frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" The older brother tilted his head, almost pitying. "There's more beneath these hills than you can fathom, and we just serve." Suddenly something moved in the shadows behind the brothers. 3 figures emerged slowly from the darkness, pale, glassy-eyed, staggering forward with unnatural stiffness. Eli recognized one instantly. It was the man he'd seen on the table. "Back!" Granger shouted. "Stay the hell back!" But the figures didn't stop. Briggs fired first, the gunshot deafening in the small space. The nearest figure collapsed, but didn't stay down, crawling toward them on hands and knees, its head lolling unnaturally to one side. Hale swore loudly, opening fire. Chaos erupted in the cellar, gunshots cracking, sparks flying from stone walls, Eli screaming as one of the figures lunged for him. Granger grabbed the boy, yanking him behind a crate, firing point-blank into the attacker's skull. Finally, silence fell again, broken only by heavy breathing and the faint drip of water somewhere deep in the tunnels. The brothers were gone. They escaped, Briggs muttered, scanning the cellar. "How the hell—" But Granger wasn't listening. He was staring at a massive iron door at the far end of the chamber, half hidden behind crates, its surface carved with the same strange symbols. A cold draft seeped from its edges, carrying with it a faint rhythmic sound like whispering. Granger stepped toward it slowly, his heart pounding. "Sheriff," Eli whispered, voice shaking. "What's down there?" Granger touched the cold metal with his fingertips, feeling the vibrations from the other side. "Whatever it is," he said softly, "it ain't human." The cellar was silent, except for the faint sound behind the iron door. Sheriff Thomas Granger stood frozen, his hand resting on the cold metal, feeling it vibrate under his fingertips. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the river. It was whispering. Eli stepped closer, clutching his rifle like a lifeline, his voice barely a breath. "Sheriff, we shouldn't open it." Granger didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. The creaking of boots, the shallow breathing of his men, the distant drip of water somewhere in the tunnels. "Deputy." Briggs ran his hand across the carved symbols on the door, tracing their strange, looping patterns. "Ain't no language I ever seen," he muttered. "Don't like the feel of it." Suddenly the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then came the voice, soft, deep, calling from behind the door. "Thomas." Granger jerked, back as though burned, his lantern nearly falling from his grasp. His name. It had said his name. Briggs paled. "Sheriff, tell me you heard that." Eli shook his head violently, his voice cracking. That ain't possible. That ain't possible." The voice came again, clearer this time, like a low breath scraping against stone. "Thomas, open it." Granger swallowed hard, forcing himself to step back from the door. "No," he whispered to himself. "No, we're leaving, right now." But then, the iron door began to shake. At first, just a faint rattle, like loose hinges trembling. Then harder, faster, until dust rained from the ceiling and the crates around them vibrated. From somewhere deep beyond the door came a low, guttural sound, like something waking after a long, unnatural sleep. Briggs raised his rifle. "Sheriff, if that door comes down, we ain't walking out of here." Granger snapped out of his daze, spinning toward the stairs. "Move, now." They scrambled back, up to the main floor, boots thundering against wood, the flickering candlelight throwing warped shadows against the walls. But as soon as they reached the dining room, they stopped dead in their tracks. The brothers were waiting. The older one stood by the staircase, holding that same hunting knife, its blade slick with something dark and wet. The younger one leaned, casually against the wall, arms folded, eyes glinting in the dim light. "You went where you shouldn't have gone," the older brother said softly, almost tenderly. "Now you've seen things you weren't meant to see." Granger raised his rifle, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "It ends tonight." The younger brother smiled faintly, tilting his head. "You still don't understand. Sheriff, this land doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to us either. We're just caretakers." "Caretakers of what?" Briggs demanded, his voice tight with fear. The older brother's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The well." Eli blinked. "The well?" The younger brother stepped forward slowly, his boots silent on the wooden floor. "You think it's just a door down there. You think it's a room. It isn't. It's a vein. It runs under the hills, under the river, under every grave in these woods. It's been here longer than the trees, longer than the people, longer than time, and it hungers." A sudden distant roar echoed from beneath the inn, shaking the floorboards violently. Dust poured from the rafters, the lanterns rattling on their hooks. Hale stumbled backward. What the hell was that? The younger brother's smile widened. "The well is waking." The sheriff didn't hesitate. "Open fire!" Gunshots erupted, deafening in the confined space. Briggs's rifle roared. Eli's hands shook as he pulled the trigger. Hale and Levi fired in unison. But the brothers didn't fall. They moved like shadows, darting between tables, blades flashing in the dim light. The older brother lunged, knocking Briggs to the floor. Before Granger could fire, Eli screamed. One of the pale, glassy-eyed figures from the cellar had stumbled up the stairs and grabbed him from behind. Granger spun and shot it clean through the head. It collapsed, twitching violently before going. Still. Then the floor shook again. Harder. And this time, something cracked. The wooden planks beneath their boots splintered, splitting open with a groan of ancient, tortured wood. From below came a blast of cold, fetid air, smelling of earth and rot and something else, something older, like stone that had never seen the light of day. The younger brother laughed. "You can't stop it, Sheriff. The well's been feeding for centuries. We're just its hands." Suddenly, the floor beneath the center table caved completely, collapsing into a yawning black hole. Granger stumbled back as the shadows below seemed to move, rippling, writhing, like liquid darkness. Climbing toward the light, from the void, dozens of pale hands reached upward, grasping blindly, clawing at the edges of the hole. And then came the faces, dozens of them twisted and half-rotted, their cloudy eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. Eli screamed, firing wildly into the pit, but for every figure that fell, another took its place, crawling upward with jerking, unnatural movements. "Fall back!" Granger shouted. "Fall back now!" The posse retreated toward the front door, dragging Briggs with them as he bled from a deep gash in his arm. Behind them, the brothers moved calmly, untouched by the chaos, their eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "You can run," the older brother said softly, "but you'll never outrun what lives beneath these hills." Granger didn't wait to argue. He shoved Eli out the door, followed by Hale and Levi, and they stumbled into the snow-covered clearing outside. The ground shook beneath their boots, vibrating like the heartbeat of some buried giant. Then came the sound. A low, rumbling roar, rising from deep within the earth, so powerful it rattled their bones and made the horses rear back in terror. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something far older, something that didn't belong in this world. And then, silence. The inn stood perfectly still, its windows dark, its doorway gaping open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Granger backed away slowly, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "This ain't over," he whispered. "Not by a damn sight." From deep below, as if carried on the wind, came the whisper again, low, hungry, unending. "Thomas?" Granger turned away, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles went white, his voice hoarse but steady. "Burn it." By nightfall, the inn was in flames, an inferno roaring high into the sky. The posse stood in silence, watching the structure collapse into itself, sending sparks and smoke spiraling into the cold Missouri night. But even as the fire consumed it, Granger couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't destroyed anything at all. The well was still there, waiting